So, hello, everyone. I'm doing a talk today about web typography. It should come as no surprise, given that I work for Typekit, that I ran a typography magazine. It's there's definitely some type nerdery going on in here. But the idea of this talk is meant to be, if you're using web type and you want to kind of up your game a little bit on the web, we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty stuff that is not only a little bit difficult to grasp sometimes, but actually isn't very well documented on the web. So one of the things that I found when researching this talk and writing a series of blog posts that I did recently was that it's very, very difficult to actually find reliable information on the web that is up to date. So I started off with a few blog posts that I wrote a couple of years ago. And it was nice because I was doing some research and I thought, okay, I need to update, see what's changed in the 2 years that have passed. And the things that were coming up in my Google searches for all of these terms to do with OpenType and stuff were my old blog posts, which was very flattering, but they were 2 years old. So in trying to bring this up to date and to talk a little bit more about what's happening with web type now, I have tried to collate a bunch of information and present it to you so that you have some resources, a reliable resource to go to, and I've been helped out massively by some of my Typekit colleagues, such as a guy called Bram Stein. But I'll talk you through some of that in a sec. I'll give you a quick introduction. This is I live in the countryside, just south of Bristol, with my wife and my dog. This is my dog, and we. And I work for a company in San Francisco called Adobe. You might have heard of them. And Typekit was previously a startup that got acquired by Adobe a couple of years ago. I'm their creative director. Jake, our designer, is here somewhere. I just saw him walk in. We're both based in Bristol. The rest of the team are kind of dispersed many places, but most of them in San Francisco. And I also founded this typography magazine called 8 Faces. Has anyone here bought a copy of 8 Faces in the past? Hey, cool, got a few hands. Cool, not as many as I like. The magazine is now finished. We did 8 issues, quite aptly, and it was a sort of limited edition magazine about typography, quite a strong focus on the web side of things, web type, stuff like that. But that, as I said, is now finished, and we're actually going to be working on a book that compiles all those 8 issues together into this kind of massive volume. So working on that at the moment. But most recently, as in literally 2 days ago, I launched a new magazine called Ligatures. And quite hilariously, the silver foiling in the title here looks like it hasn't got a title. So I'll show you some other photos. So yeah, we literally launched this a couple of days ago. It's kind of, this is, let me tell you about 8 Faces. 8 Faces came out of my desire to make something permanent. So I'm a web designer traditionally. And I worked on the web for years and years and years, and eventually got frustrated with the fact that many of the things I was making would disappear after years, sometimes months, sometimes even weeks if you're doing something like a holding page. So I wanted to have this sense of permanence, something that you would want to actually keep put on your bookshelf, and it would still be there in years to come. So that was my motivation, kind of selfish motivation, really, to create 8 Faces. I didn't really do much print stuff. I did the odd kind of print job, but I'd never really done a full-scale print project, certainly not a magazine. So I did that, and I really learnt a hell of a lot while doing that. It was a really, really educational experience. I was lucky to talk to sort of type legends like Eric Spiekermann, who would give me advice and criticize my widows and orphans and all this kind of stuff. And I learnt a lot about type as I was doing this printed magazine. And then when I went back to doing web work again, I found that I had this new perspective on design as a whole, but very much typography. Going back to the web with those kind of, the eyes that had been opened by print design really changed my perspective on a lot of stuff. And I realized gradually, as we did all these different issues, so we did 8 issues, it ran for 4 years, that every time I went back to the web, I was kind of bringing across a new set of skills that I'd learned from print design to do with typography. And the really exciting thing is about working on the web right now is that the web is very, very much almost caught up with what we can do in print, which is really exciting, especially with things like open type features and all that fun stuff, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. But yes, after doing 8 Faces, we launched Log On, which is this brand new magazine. It's very designy, but it's not about design. We're trying to step out into the wider world of lifestyle magazines. We got some really beautiful photos by people like Dan Rubin, who I'm sure you know, some lovely illustrations. Eric Spiekman is in there for type fans who miss his little input. And just quickly, before we move on, I've got an offer for everyone here today. So, as I said, we launched this a couple of days ago. But for Generate folks, I've done on the train here this morning, put this promo code together so that if you would like to buy the magazine or a 3-issue subscription perhaps, this code will get you 50% off any order. That includes even if you just want to buy the PDF. But that's only valid till 2 p.m. It will auto-explode at 2 p.m. today. So if you want to get in there quick. I won't be at all offended if you have your heads down looking at your iPhones and laptops. Anyway, let's get on to fonts and typefaces. Fonts versus typefaces. This is something that I like to rant about a lot, get very irate about it, speak on Twitter a lot about this, getting very upset when people don't know the difference. Does everyone know the difference between a font and a typeface? There's a few hands. Where's Jake? Jake, where's your hand? Okay, so it's pretty easy to remember. I always use the MP3 analogy. A font is the format in the same way that an MP3, an MP3 is to a song. Like you don't buy a song as such. You actually buy an MP3. That's the physical thing. You buy fonts. You don't buy typefaces. The typeface is the design, the thing that exists in the ether. But yes, so I like to get up on stage and rant about this as well. But it's important to remember these differences. I think especially when you're talking about type, it's important to use the right terms. And remember that every time that you say font instead of typeface, Eric Spiekman kills a kitten. So, with that, let's get on to actually talking about some web type. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, I did a series of blog posts a couple of years ago that explored different open type features. I did one on the fine flourish of the ligature, one on small caps and old style numerals, swashes, and style sets. So, as I said, you can find these on my site. Some of the stuff is a bit outdated now, but I've since rewritten new posts that talk about the new developments. As I said, I went back to these when I started compiling this talk and realized that in 2 years, not necessarily a whole bunch of stuff had changed. When I'd originally done these blog posts, it was actually quite exciting because all this new stuff was happening all the time. The kind of support that we have for web typography was kind of changing on a day-to-day basis, and things have slowed down a bit now. And in a way, I was a little bit disappointed that things have kind of slowed. But actually, I think it's pretty good because it allows us time to kind of reflect on stuff, to actually experiment with these new features. Because it's not moving at this lightning-fast pace anymore, we can actually reliably use some of this stuff to make our type on our sites look really beautiful. So I'll talk you through a brief recap of these blog posts and the stuff that's changed, and a bit about current support. We're going to start off with ligatures. Now, this is the post that we have here, and it's pretty straightforward, and the good news is that ligatures are very, very widely supported. So it's very easy to turn on, and they're on by default in Firefox. So this is often how people turn on ligatures. Text rendering, optimized legibility will turn ligatures on, and a bunch of other open type features as well. However, use with caution, because it's not really the best way of doing so. The best way of doing so is actually the far more powerful font feature settings. And this allows you to be a little bit more granular, to go in and say, I want to turn this specific OpenType feature on or off, which is really, really useful. Also, optimized legibility is not standardized and is a little bit buggy. So generally not recommended, especially for body text. So support for our friend font feature settings seems on the face of it pretty good, right? So how many people here use caniuse.com? A lot of people here. So you look at this, and it's a little bit hard to see on this screen, but there's a lot of green on there. And green is always good. That looks like, great, okay, I can use this now. I can use it in a bunch of different browsers. That's awesome. But it's a little bit deceptive in that sense, because it really varies a lot from browser to browser and platform to platform. So just seeing like the font feature settings is supported is great, but that's talking about the umbrella term. There are specific parts of that which are supported and not, and that's where it gets a little bit confusing, and that's what I'm trying to distill down today. So, I hate it when web designers get on stage and show code. It's really tedious and boring, and I really try and avoid doing that in any talk that I do. However, for this, because we're kind of getting a little bit nerdy and we are saying specifically how do you enable these things, I thought it's useful to show a little bit of code. So there's not much, there's just a little bit, so that you can at least go away and, if you haven't done so already, experiment with some of these features. So this is how you would basically turn on ligatures. This is the more future-proof code. Of course, as we well know, life isn't like that. Life is actually full of vendor prefixes. So let me quickly talk you through these, and then we'll move away from the code. So the top line, text rendering optimized legibility, is kind of the traditional way of turning this on. As I said, it's a bit buggy, it's non-standard, it's generally not recommended, especially for body text. However, if you really wanted to make sure that you absolutely had this feature, you could enable that, so you kind of covered all your bases. The second two lines relate to Firefox. The first is the correct, or the most up-to-date one. The ligger with the equal sign in there is slightly out of date. So for older versions of Firefox, I think maybe Firefox 15. And the others are, as you can imagine, that we have to cover all our other bases. So ligatures are turned on by default in Safari and Firefox. Kind of confusingly, Safari, it's a weird one. It doesn't support font feature settings, right? And that's Safari on the desktop and on iOS. It doesn't support font feature settings, but even though it doesn't, it actually has ligatures turned on by default. I have not tested this in the Yosemite release of it, so that may change. As I said, they're on by default in Firefox. And the weird thing about Safari, at least with the current version, is that it doesn't support font feature settings, but it has ligatures on. But weirdly, it has ligatures on, contextual ligatures, and required ligatures. They're enabled by default, but not discretionary ligatures. So if you want discretionary ligs, you need to turn them on manually. It's a bit weird, but this is what I mean. Like, every browser has its own little inconsistencies. So, if you really want to get nerdy, and you really want to jump down that rabbit hole, or perhaps just send yourself to sleep at night when you really can't get to sleep, have a look at the working draft of the CSS3 spec, where you can read all about the stuff that's proposed for the future. So although I'm talking about font feature settings today a lot, and that's how we use this stuff today, actually that's not really how we're eventually going to do it. This is the font variant ligatures property, which will be introduced, which eventually, in theory, will become a standard. And that is even more powerful. And that's how we will be turning this stuff on. So even how all of these things I'm describing today are still kind of stopgaps, essentially. When you look to the spec, you get a bit of a glimpse into a potential future where these things might go. As I said, it's super nerdy, and I find it really tedious. But if you do want to look into it, then that is the place to go. So the second post that I gave that I wrote was about small caps and old style numerals. Now here in this example you can see the word CSS, the other words are just disappearing because the contrast is really high. But the word CSS is in small caps, 1, 2, 3 is in old style numerals. Now there are different ways to turn these on, and the ways that I've enabled them in the post is actually a little bit of a hack, but I'll get to that in just a sec. We use font feature settings to turn on features such as small caps and old style numerals, and you will see a pattern emerging here. This is how you do it. It's pretty straightforward. And these codes are these 4-letter codes are the same as you would find in font tables. It's all pretty straightforward. No huge surprises there. Now, when you get to the CSS3 spec, if you want to look at that, they have these really inconsistent jump links in there. It's crazy. But if you want to have a look at that, it's the prop def font variant that we will eventually one day be using. But again, I'm going to skip over that. Swashes and style sets. Now, like the other post, I also used a bit of a hack here. I used subsets to do this, and I'll get to that in a sec. But just so you know, the S and the yellow S as well, and the W are all swash characters. They're not the standard characters that would appear if you just type that typeface. And this is when you use style sets to perhaps change, to get different characters, so alternate glyphs. So for instance, this typeface Brie you might go, oh, I love Brie, it's really cool, but its Z's a bit crazy and its Q's really funky. And I realized for the first time I did this talk, I'd used this old screenshot of when I did it, when Chrome, and I realized, oh man, I've taken it in Chrome, and Chrome doesn't even support this. This is really bad, because if you look at this line at the top, and then you look at the one down there, they actually look exactly the same, and they're not meant to look the same. They are meant to be different. However, when I then checked to see, and this was about a couple of months ago when I revised this talk, to see what the support was, lo and behold, Chrome now does support style sets. So this is pretty cool, because in this example, you could use a typeface. Perhaps you've used Brie for your company logo, and it works absolutely perfectly for that. But you're using it for body text, and it's kind of maybe a little bit full-on for body text. You don't want to have all those crazy, curly characters and everything. So this is a useful way of doing that. Or maybe you just want to pick a different ampersand, something like that. So style sets are how you would select that. And some fonts have them, some fonts don't. You'd be surprised by how many fonts do have them. It's just that most people don't access some of these deeper features. That's how we will eventually turn it on. I'm going to skip over that. Now, font feature settings. It's exactly the same for doing swashes and style sets. You use this property. And as I mentioned, here are some examples of these 4-number tags that will allow you to turn these things on. And these are all these exist within fonts. These are like standard font codes for turning on these particular features. So they're quite widely documented. Microsoft even have an actually very, very well documented site about all of the OpenType tags, and it's actually scarily long. Now, turning these on, so it's pretty easy to remember. You can look up these codes. It's very, very easy to remember once you get into it, and you can reuse this stuff. It's certainly a lot easier than remembering that you shouldn't pronounce it Helvetica Neue. Because don't forget that every time you say Helvetica Neue instead of Helvetica Neue, Eric Spiekermann kills a kitten. So please think of the kittens. Subsetting. Now, this is the thing that I mentioned before. Suddenly when I did a couple of those posts, I had to hack away at them because the support for some of these features wasn't actually there at the time. So I actually kind of hacked my way around it by using subsets. Now, subsets, if you're not familiar with the term, it's something that comes from a pre-open type age of fonts. So in the open type world that we have now, you can put loads and loads and loads and loads of glyphs inside a font file, which you can then access. You can have 7 different A's, 8 different B's, whatever. All language support, everything, all in one file. It's fantastic. But prior to that, when file size was more restricted, you could only have a certain number of characters. And so if you wanted things like small caps, or even ligatures, or old-style numerals, you would usually actually have to have a separate font file that gave you those characters. That's what happened in the pre-open type world. But actually, we've kind of reused this idea on the web in more recent times. So here, what I've done, CSS and 123, they are wrapped in spans, and then those spans are served completely different font files. Right? So there is those files there. They're not being rendered in the same as everything else. They are getting their own specific font for those little spans. So we're subsetting it, and that particular font contains only small caps and old-style numerals. This is the font that's used from FontDeck. It is they have a term for this. They call them expert subsets. And the idea is that you go there and you go specifically for a font that contains the features you want, and then use it for this exact thing to serve it to specific parts of your type on screen. On Typekit, we don't specifically have a thing called subsets, but you will often find a few fonts that are obviously not for general use, but they might be just for swashes, for instance. So active poster swashes, which is the typeface that's used in this example here, the S, let's go back, the S, the W, and the S are actually, again, they're wrapped in spans, and they're getting actually a different font file. And the font file they're getting is just this version, just the version that contains swashes, nothing else. So if you really want to have swashes or whatever, an open type feature that maybe isn't widely supported, perhaps your clients require you to build a site that is for an older browser where support isn't as good, you can still kind of hack. You can still do a few fancy things with wrapping things in spans, which obviously can be done automatically with JavaScript, and then serve specific font files to those bits of your type. So it's still possible to get support even if you're working within the constraints of older browsers. So I'm going to talk about kerning now. Kerning is one of the things that I didn't cover in those posts from 2 years ago. So this is one of the updated ones, and I've blogged about this recently. Kerning is something we all like to show off that we know a little bit about type. How many long-suffering partners do we have who get tired every time we point out the badly kerned shop sign? I know my wife is a long sufferer. But yeah, how do we turn it on? It's a bit of a semi-mystery. Are there different ways of turning it on? Is it on automatically? Is it on automatically in some browsers? Do some browsers not support it at all? This is some of the stuff that I've been trying to research, and it is difficult to find some of this information online, which is why I'm trying to collate it. Before we go on, I spoke at this conference earlier this year, Kerning. I just love their logo. I always want to give a shout out to their logo because I think it's absolutely brilliant. So, turning on kerning. Let's look again. This is how people traditionally have turned it on. This kind of not particularly safe, but kind of catch-all option of text rendering optimized legibility. As I mentioned before, it's not for the best. It is much better to use, you guessed it, font feature settings. Absolutely no surprises there. Now, a little bit of code coming up. Again, just to show you how it looks pretty straightforward. I've left out the ones here. You might have noticed there were ones in the other example. So you can use these Boolean values to turn it on or off. It's actually kind of optional at the moment. So you could just have that. You don't necessarily need to have the ones. Again, it's one of those weird things that's kind of semi in flux at the moment. You might see some examples and not others. If you want to do it today, you obviously got to have your browser prefixes, your vendor prefixes. So we have them there. That's how you could cover all of your bases. Again, the code for kern is the standardized one that you get absolutely everywhere. Now, kerning is turned on by default in Firefox and in Safari, and that's Safari on Mac and on iOS. Now, a really, really useful table that I thoroughly recommend looking at, and I know it's totally biased because it's written by my colleague and it's on the Typekit blog, but our colleague Bramstein, super, super smart guy, I'll show you some of his work in a minute, he has got this blog post that has this table on it. And it is so useful to look at because he cares deeply, deeply about this stuff, and he's actually documenting the actual support that you get for either text rendering or font feature settings, all the different browsers and all the different OpenType features that it supports. So if you want to have a look at it and you want to really know and have a definitive source, do have a look at Bram's blog, which is on the Typekit blog. If you don't get a chance to write down that URL, you can search the Typekit blog. Now, let's talk a bit about manual kerning, for display type specifically. So when you think about it, kerning has kind of existed for ages because we've always had the letter spacing property. Like, that's properly old school, right? I've always had that. And as long as you've got that, you could just wrap stuff in spans, and then you could change that letter spacing property, and so that you moved your A closer to your V or further apart or whatever. And that's actually pretty easy. So who here has ever used Lettering.js from Dave Rupert? Lettering.js is awesome. If you haven't used it yet, what it does essentially is it will wrap your words, or indeed your letters, in spans automatically with JavaScript, so you don't have to worry about dirtying up your actual markup. And then once that you've got the spans, which are word 1, word 2, word 3, whatever, you can then use whatever you want to start doing things to them. So, for instance, you could wrap each letter automatically in a span, like letter 1, letter 2, letter 3, and then you can use the letter spacing property to move them back and forth. It's kind of an old school hack, but it works really well. And if you're doing display type and you really care about getting your kerning right, and maybe you can't turn it on in the browser, or you just want to have real manual control over it, it's actually a really, really useful tool. Building on that, there's kern.js. Now what this is basically takes Dave's JavaScript and builds a tool on this, a little bookmarklet that allows you to click on a letter and then move it over. And it's really, really useful. You can actually no, I want it to be over there, I'll just drag it over there a bit. And then it spits out the CSS for you to use. So instead of you changing your CSS and saving all the time and checking it, this will actually allow you to do it visually, and then when you're happy at the end, you've got a bunch of code ready to go. Let's talk briefly about justification and hyphenation, and this is something that Bram is an expert in. And again, this is getting to the next level of uber web type geekiness, really crafting beautiful type on the web. This is the kind of thing that we need to start considering. So there's a lot of mystery involving this. I'm going to go very nerdy for a brief second. Does anyone know about the two different algorithms that are used in software to justify text? Chris does. Just Chris Murphy? Oh, guys. Okay, well, I'm going to go into it, and it's really tedious. So basically, there are two algorithms that are used. There is the greedy algorithm, that what it does is it looks at one line and then works out how much space there should be in one line. So you're justifying it. It just looks at the one line and then makes a calculation based on that. And then there's the much more advanced Nuth-Plus algorithm that looks at all the lines in a paragraph and then makes its decisions about how best to space the type there. And that's the algorithm that's present in apps like InDesign, for instance. Now, guess which one is used on the web when you justify text? That's right, it's the shit one. And it's a shame because basically the CSS3 spec doesn't define what algorithm to use. It completely comes down to browser vendors. But as you might imagine, the more advanced one has a performance trade-off, so everyone went for the easy one. Now, the CSS3 spec, it did introduce text justify, which does allow you to control some aspects of hyphenation, but it doesn't. That is the one that is the spec that doesn't specify it. But the one that's introduced recently is the newspaper property. So text justify equals newspaper is actually a CSS property that is supported in, guess which browser? Come on. Which browser would adopt a really forward-thinking, advanced typography element? Who said IE? You're right. Internet Explorer is actually the browser that supports this, which is really interesting. But hey, IE4 was supported at FontFace, so there we go. So let's not diss Microsoft. So just quickly, Bram's built a couple of JavaScript-based tools that do proper justification in the browser using JavaScript. Now, obviously, there's a lot of processing going on there because you're doing it with JavaScript, but it's an interesting look at what it could be, what we could actually implement, perhaps what we will eventually implement natively in browsers. So have a look at that. Similarly, he's got a tool about hyphenation, which is Hypha. And it will, again, it's a JavaScript-based tool that will hyphenate in the browser, really nicely set type. But again, it's an experiment. There's a big overhead in terms of performance. And so this isn't something that we can really use right now, unfortunately. So hyphenation is kind of widespread, but weirdly not in Chrome. Chrome doesn't support hyphenation. But for Chrome and older browsers, you can use some of this JavaScript stuff if you want. So we can hyphenate, but essentially we can't justify text very well yet. That's the status quo. At the moment, there isn't a great deal we can do in that area. Whew, still with me? Here's a picture of my dog. So let's talk about responsive web typography. And to begin with, let's talk about body type. Now, for me, when I talk about responsive design, for me it's very much about typography, and it is very much specifically about measure, that is line length. Now, achieving the right measure, I think, is really important. It's really important for readability. It is, can you remember like when responsive design was a thing and everyone made their sites all bendy and suddenly you had all these lines of text that are like all the way over there and you have to jump back? And a lot of people didn't necessarily consider that, actually, we need like smaller line lengths. So let's talk a little bit about this. As Oliver Reichenstein said, web design is 99% typography. This was a few years ago, but it is absolutely true. So I'm going to just talk you through a few things. So here's the Read Online site for for Digest magazine that Kira and I did. And so this is what we have here is like the sort of mobile-like version. And what we do with this, and it's something that I do on my own site as well, is that we gradually increase the type size, and when it gets too big, then actually increase the padding on the main element so that your container gets a little bit smaller. So as you can see here, it starts off small, type size grows a bit, and then we actually change the container. So then you get this kind of left margin, and that brings the measure in a bit neater. And then the type size goes up again. It's a useful way of attaining that measure. This is kind of how it works. Just some quick code. So this is an approximation of this. You have some media queries. And at the points that you want, you up the font size. So I'm going to up the font size a little bit, and it's getting bigger. That's all cool. Oh, my line length's getting a little bit too long. Okay, I'm going to have some more padding on the HTML element to kind of shunt it in a little bit. Then a little bit bigger, like bigger media queries. I'm going to up the font size again, and then again, once it gets even bigger, then bring the padding in a bit. So this is kind of what happens. I need to find an accurate, intelligent way of explaining this other than just me waving my arms on stage, because that's kind of all I've got at the moment. But Trent Walton has a really great tool So Robert Brinkhurst, in his book, Elements of Typographic Style, he says that the optimum measure is around 45 to 75 characters per line. Now, I like to do things by feel. I like to not worry necessarily about exact figures, but just see if something feels right or not. However, if you do want to do it by feel, and you say, okay, well, Robert Brinkhurst, he's the guy, we're gonna stick to those rules. Trent's come up with a great technique, which is this. So you place an asterisk between, character 45 and character 75, right? And then you have your media queries going and all this stuff, and then when the two asterisks then land on the same line, you realize that your measure is then too long, and it's time to put another media query in and kick them in so that the asterisks are on different lines again. Kind of a useful technique. But again, I think it's better to do things by feel, so maybe start off with this, and then once you get a feel for what is a good line length, or a good measure, then you can do away with this and actually just start to feel what feels right. I'm generally against the idea, well, I'm not against the idea of max width, but I feel like in a way that many people use max width goes against the idea of responsive web design. So I did this kind of experiment where there's absolutely no max width and stuff just keeps getting bigger and bigger with this CSS Zen Garden theme that I made recently in the last few months. Now this is an experiment, but what it does is the type just keeps getting bigger and bigger and the blocks keep getting bigger and bigger. But the type size and the block size always results, I think, in a pleasing measure. So you never really get long lines. So even though everything is growing, we're keeping it all in control. So have a look at that Zen Garden example if you want to have a look at that. There is some really interesting work being done by people like Marko Dugonik. He did this. Anyone seen this? This is a really cool experiment where it uses your camera, your built-in eyesight camera or whatever, to actually, when you move closer to the screen, it's got this face detection thing, and it will up the font size, or it will reduce the font size. So you move further away, and the type gets bigger. Kind of a cool little experiment. So here, there's me in a hotel room getting a bit closer, so the type size goes smaller. I think you could have some fun with this. You could perhaps trick people, and then perhaps if they get really close, like your grandma's looking at it, you turn it into Comic Sans. But there's some really interesting stuff as well going on with viewport size typography, which is another way of changing your type on the fly. Now, the interesting thing about this, and here's an example from CSS Tricks, is that whereas media queries have specific points where you then do stuff, viewport size typography, this will basically allow you to, the font size continually grows. So as you move the browser out very, very slowly, as we love to do, and then do this, it's constantly changing. There's no set value at any point. So it's kind of interesting because that's kind of how it looks. And hey, look, no media queries. But you're achieving a media query-like kind of thing. This is pretty experimental. I probably wouldn't use this on the live site right now. But it's interesting to look at all these different techniques that are going on. Right, I'm going to shoot through because I've only got 5 minutes left. So let's briefly talk about display type. Has anyone used fit text, which is also by Dave Ruffert? Really, really cool plugin. Effectively, what this does is it makes your type perform like an image set to 100% width. So it will flex and bend with your container without the type wrapping around or anything like that. It's as if it was an image. Really, really cool. There is some really interesting experiments being done by people like Nick Sherman. So here, what he's doing is saying, depending on the width of your browser, he's actually going to swap out for a different font. So it's typefaces rather that contain multiple widths. So you might have everything from an ultra condensed through to an ultra wide and everything in between. He's actually saying, well, we can swap them out. So we're going to shrink these down. If you have a look at what's the good example here, maybe the Goner one, you can see it might be slightly difficult to see, but this is actually slightly wider. The Brooklyn example here, that's about the same. But it's probably not an experiment that you would want to use on all of your client sites. But it's another option available to us if we want to get really pedantic about type on the web. So, I'm going to conclude. As I said before, I think it's a good thing that things have slowed down a bit, that we can now experiment with this stuff, and we don't have to worry about support changing. And as you've seen, the stuff is still kind of crazy, like the way that some things are supported and some aren't. But things have slowed down, they're a little bit more reliable. You can actually go now and build a live client site that's going to be seen by thousands, millions of people, and use some of these features and not worry about them. But the important thing about it is that if some of the features do break, like, isn't necessarily the end of the world. Some of them, it's really going to break. But if you just don't have ligatures, no one's going to cry about that. So, font feature settings is our friend. It's really cool, but there are some things. Remember that it can be still a bit buggy. On my site recently, a lot of people got in touch because anytime that you selected text, I had like this black text selection thing, and you had, anytime you did that, all of the text would suddenly kind of just go totally mental. And the reason for that is if you have a custom selection color, in which case I had black, and you use font feature settings on type, it just completely screws it up. So don't do that. Instead, if you want to have a custom selection color, use one like I now have, which is yellow, so I don't have to change the color of the type. Sorry, I've said it wrong. It's the type color that is actually the thing that messes with it. So as long as you have a selection thing where it doesn't require you to change the actual color of your type when the type is selected, you're okay to use font feature settings. But let's get through to there's four main points that we need to consider, and this actually hasn't really changed from when I wrote those posts a couple of years ago. So consider the typeface. So that is the design, the thing that exists in the ether that was created by the designer. Does the actual design contain swashes, ligatures, all this kind of stuff? Because if it's not in the actual design, it's never going to make it to the font file, and it's certainly never going to make it to your browser. So at the base level, did the person who designed this typeface actually design your secondary A style set option? Possibly not. Consider the font file. So is it actually an OpenType font file being served? We're talking about OpenType settings here. You're never going to be able to turn on an OpenType setting if you're serving a true type font. So this is a really important thing to consider. And even if it is OpenType, are the actual glyphs that you need inside the font file? Possibly not. For instance, at Typekit, you have to turn on all characters to get all of the characters. So by default, we will give you like a smaller subset. And we're doing some work on that to improve that, and some exciting stuff is on its way. But for the moment, there are some considerations. You know, what if you do that and then you get way more characters than you need? There's a slight trade-off with file size. So consider the browser. Which browsers are actually supported? Some browsers support some features, some they don't. Some it's different on different operating systems. So no matter how robust your CSS is, if you're testing it in a browser that physically won't support that feature, we're not going to see it. And lastly, and most importantly, consider the user. So as I said before, will the design actually break if ligatures are missing? Probably not. But quite possibly it will if the swash characters are missing and you're actually representing the company logo in WebType. So these are, perhaps in that circumstance, you need to find another way of doing that. So we talked about responsive web typography, and responsive web design is where all our heads are at. But I think it's also very much about responsible web typography, about considering all of these cool, shiny new features are great, but we need to be mindful of when we're using them, need to think about the user, need to think about unwanted trade-offs like larger file size, slower download times, this kind of thing. So it's about picking the right features that you want for the right scenario. And as I said before, overall, this is a really, really exciting time to be working on the web, because we've essentially almost caught up to what you can do with print. There's now, I can do a bunch of stuff in InDesign, and I can now go over to my browser and virtually do most of that stuff with CSS. And that has changed in the last 2 to 3 years. Certainly, say, 3-4 years ago, there's absolutely no way that you could make a statement like that. And that's why I love working with type on the web. And also, my site is in much of a need of an update, because I am not practicing what I'm preaching here for a lot of it, so my apologies for that. However, there is a new site on the way. There's nothing at the moment, it's just kind of a holding page with some links. Advancedwebtypography.com. So if you go there, if you want to get any links from today for like the blog posts and stuff like that, I've compiled a bunch of them there. That will be improved over time. This is eventually going to be a workshop that I'm doing next month, and then it's probably going to be a book next year. Also, I want to point out Tim Brown's excellent resource, which is Typekit Practice. So this is something that we built at Typekit, very, very much led by Tim Brown. He and I worked on the design of it, and it's a really, really great resource. Essentially, it's like a resource for web type, or just actually typography in general, to exist in one place with some really great examples and some very, very robust code samples, so that you can then go and try stuff yourself as well. So do have a look at that. It's practice.typekit.com. And with that, I would like to say thank you very much for having me.